Okay, it's 3 o'clock, and welcome to the Department of Geography Colloquium series for spring 2021. 2020 is over, and here we are in the spring semester, and we're having an amazing amount of fun. Just an announcement before we begin today's colloquium. Next week's colloquium will feature one of our very own geographers, Dr. Esther Mullins, who will be talking about extreme precipitation. It's going to be a fun talk, and we look forward to that. A reminder for faculty, there'll be some graduate students giving talks. Hello? There'll be some graduate students giving talks next semester. Please fill out evaluation forms and send them to me, fic@ufl.edu. Thank you very much. Well, without further ado, let's move on. Our guest speaker today is Alex Orenstein. He's a freelance data scientist and a geographer currently based in Dakar, Senegal. He holds a bachelor's degree from Florida State in Middle Eastern Studies, an MS in Developmental Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. And for the last 10 years, he's been working for NGOs, United Nations agencies, governments, and political campaigns across the US, Senegal, Mali, and elsewhere in West Africa. We're really excited to have him with us. I know he has some outreach here with the department, and there's some potential collaborations I know in the future with some of our professors. And we're eager to hear about his latest project that involves applied GIS to help seasonal migration routes of nomadic herders in West Africa. Thanks for sharing your research with us, Alex, and we're excited about your talk. Without further ado, take it away.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. Thanks for that warm welcome, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to spend your afternoon with me talking about cow maps. So if I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And let's hope. I think everyone can see the presentation, right?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, as Tim said, my name is Alex. I'm a data scientist and geographer. I'm based in Dakar, in Senegal. And for the better part of the past 10 years, I've been working on pastoralism here. So I've been working on using GIS to provide data products for pastoralists, for herders, and about pastoralists and herders. So what I'm hoping to talk to you today here about for the next 45 minutes or so is a little bit about the work and why it's important and why mapping pastoralism is important. So let's situate ourselves a little bit here. When we talk about the Sahel, where do we mean? Now, everyone seems to have a different opinion of what the Sahel is. But for me, it's the area between Senegal and Chad. And it's the area between where the Sahara meets the savannah. So it's a spot that's it's big, it's enormous, and it's hot and it's dry. And as you can see from the lower right on the screen, it's prone to a lot of climatic variability. So that's a graph that shows precipitation anomalies, rainfall changes. So you can see that it can go easily from one year having a drought, being in the negative, to having a flood, being in the positive. And this happens year in, year out. So this is a place that's volatile and that can be vulnerable to climate shocks. And when we talk about pastoralists, who are we talking about? We are talking about people who depend on livestock for their livelihood, and they're mobile. So they, for their livelihoods, they herd cattle, goats, sheep, sometimes camels, and they require natural biomass. So they need pasture and water for their herds and their livelihoods to survive. So this is a picture I took in northern Senegal, and it shows a pastoralist family filling an inner tube with water to bring back to their herds. So sometimes you can't bring your animals to the water and you have to bring the water to your animals. So all this to say that there's a vulnerability here to climate shocks. This is a group of people who number in the dozens of millions across West Africa and who are entirely dependent on oftentimes volatile natural resources for their survival. So to illustrate a little bit here what that looks like, I've prepared a little bit of a very basic seasonal calendar that you can see on the top right of the screen. And it shows basically what the seasons are in West Africa. So from July to October, we have our rainy season. Sometimes it's shorter than that, and very rarely is it longer than that. Once it ends, we enter in the cold, dry season. And that's when what we call transhumance begins. And transhumance is when the herds move to find pasture and water. So they'll stay in what we call their home territory for the rainy season. And then once the rainy season ends, those resources start to dry up and they have to move. The lakes dry up, the pasture thins and yellows. And by the time March, April rolls around, we hit the hot, dry season. This is also known as the lean season. This is where conditions get quite fragile. So if you see this image on the right-hand side of the screen, it shows a lake, or a pond rather, during the wet season in Mopti. The image to the right of that is the exact same pond in May. So the left image is taken in September, the right image is taken in May. This is not a particularly bad drought year. This is a regular year. This is a regular occurrence. So this is to show you how drastic seasonality can be. And just going from the wet season to going to the dry season makes an enormous difference. And lastly, I want to show you this GIF. It's one of my favorite GIFs that I think really shows how delicate the situation of natural resources can be in pastoral areas. So this is a lake in northern Senegal, in an area called Kenen, where most people depend on mobile livestock herding for their livelihoods. This is a lake. So you can see that, we're in the hot, dry season and it comes to almost nothing. And then boom, almost overnight, by the time that the end of July rolls around, the lake gets huge, the rain fills it up. But then January comes and it shrinks down to almost nothing again in the dry season. So this really, I think, does a good job of showing you how precarious that balance can be. So why are these things important to map? Why is it important to map natural resources? Why is it important to map drought? Well, for pastoralists, it's important to have data to anticipate their movement, to plan their movements. They need to know where the pasture and water is to move their herds. And they need to be able to anticipate drought. For the humanitarian sector, for governments, for NGOs, they need to understand how drought impacts pastoral communities, which is something that still, at the institutional level, doesn't really happen. Pastoralists are typically very underserved by humanitarian aid and often live in areas, at least in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they live in areas that are poorly serviced by the state, where the state has very little presence. So these actors needed to be able to geographically target their aid distribution to pastoralist communities, which can be very hard to do when your community is mobile, when they're moving for 9 months out of the year. And then lastly, this is important to map because anticipating transhumance is critical. Land use conflicts are on the rise in West Africa, and being able to understand transhumance movements and being able to anticipate them can allow for better land use planning and can help avoid conflicts. So to give you an example of transhumance, I wanted to show you this map. It's made by the OECD. And it shows a few of the larger transhumance networks, or routes, I should say. So what I like about this map is it shows you that transhumance is a diverse activity. So you've got different kinds of movements. So you've got these big, these big thick arrows that show commercial movements. These are large herds moving towards markets, and they can go very far. They can go hundreds and hundreds of miles, oftentimes going on trucks, And then you've got smaller movements going across borders, these thinner arrows, they're smaller. These movements might be of smaller herds. And I think what I like about this map is it shows you that transhumance is heterogeneous. Transhuman movements are heterogeneous, and there is not necessarily like a one-size-fits-all description to how pastoralists and how herders move their animals. Sometimes they move it on a commercial basis to find the best price in the market if they're trying to settle. If they're a commercial herder, other times they are trying to find pasture and water. So I'd like to illustrate a little more about what drought and what pasture can look like. So this is a map prepared by Action contre la faim, which is an NGO that operates in West Africa. And this is what they call a biomass map. To put it simply, this is all the vegetation that grew during the rainy season in West Africa, in the Sahel. And it shows areas that in green that have a surplus of vegetation, right? That they produced more than average. And then red for places where they didn't, where they produced under average. Basically, green good, red bad. Now, this is a map from 2020. This was the end of the rainy season in October 2020. What you can see is it's pretty good. Lots of green, not a whole lot of red. 2020 was an exceptional year for pasture growth. But let's go back 1 year to 2019. Not as good. It's a much more mixed situation. You have, the center of Mali where things are looking good, and then you have Mauritania and Senegal where, to put it scientifically, it's shit. You've got terrible outlook for biomass growth, and you had pretty dry pastures. So it can go from 1 year being great to 1 year being not so great, and being even in a crisis situation. And if we go back 2 years from here to 2017, we find this is what a crisis looked like. You had pasture deficits all across the area. You had red covering the map. And this was a terrible year for pastoralists. And I really want to hone in on 2017 because I think it's important to show what the stakes are in this. The 2017-2018 drought was terrible for pastoralists. Pastures dried out across the Sahel and herds were decimated. There's still a number of pastoral communities that have not yet recovered from the devastation of 2017 with the enormous amounts of livestock that died during this period. And there was a very high human cost as well. Like there was already going into 2017, it was a year racked by conflict, market failures across West Africa. And then you add on top of this drought. So you had a situation of already bad, severe acute malnutrition. You had a very high caseload already, a lot of children already being treated for severe acute malnutrition. You threw in a drought and those rates skyrocketed. It was the highest rate of severe acute malnutrition in 10 years. 1.6 million children were affected. And then lastly, you had an irregular herd movement. You had early herd migrations, and you had some pretty bad tensions around land use, and you had agro-pastoral conflict. So all that's to say, the stakes are high. And being able to anticipate drought and being able to map natural resources is critical for pastoralists and for the organizations that are supposed to help people in times of crisis. But then we get into another question, where do you look? The Sahel is huge. Okay, so if we know a situation is bad in the Sahel, here, this is this 2017 map again, what are the areas that are important for pastoralists? If we just say it's bad everywhere, how does that help someone trying to target aid? How do they know where to find pastoralists? How do they know where to find these movements? And that's when we get into the question of how do you map herd movements, which is a critical question that still has a fair amount of debate. So when I began trying to map herd movements systematically in 2015, my team and I started with GPS tracking. And that was a failure. GPS tracking didn't work. We were not able to get, it was nearly impossible, we found, to get a representative sample of herds across an entire very heterogeneous zone. And then likewise, we found that the equipment just we couldn't get it to work, and a lot of herders rightly felt like their privacy was being invaded. Next, you had the very high resolution satellite imagery. This was a non-starter from the get-go. This was proposed to use, high resolution imagery to map herds. Didn't work. You couldn't get images timed right. It was very expensive, and there wasn't really a way you could automate it. At the end of the day, you would still have to be counting cows on images. Then we had drones, right? Every time you've got a project, there's always a drone guy, and drones were again a non-starter. You had the first fact that, it's a pretty strong invasion of privacy. People don't really like being spied on by a flying robot. You have the knowledge that drones are used in conflict in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger. So no, that was a non-starter. And then you had, of course, AI, right? The idea that, well, we can, if these three systems aren't producing results, why don't we use AI and, get an algorithm to make it good? Unsurprisingly, this also didn't work. Garbage in, garbage out. If your inputting data is not reliable, doesn't matter how great your algorithm is, you're going to get crap. So what we ended up doing was what we should have frankly done from the start, which was just ask people. And we basically had a system where we would give herders and members of herding communities Sharpies on a laminated map, and they would draw the routes themselves. Now, I understand that in the last hurricane season, Donald Trump kind of sullied the name of Sharpie cartography, but I'd want you to give it a second chance. And what I really liked about this method was that I think it really laid bare the fixation that a lot of aid practitioners have on what they call the technical fix, right? The idea that we have to go for the shiniest, sexiest, newest solution, right? Use tech, use big data, all these things. But why, if the answer can be found just by asking someone? So that's what we did. We implemented asking people. And so we put together a system that wasn't new, wasn't innovative, and worked very well. Basically, we made these laminated maps, and we had these meetings that you see on the top left corner with pastoral cooperatives, where they traced out the areas that were important to them, the movements. And then on the right, top right, you can see what that map looked like. So this is the result of the discussion. And what was great about having it done in a group is that you got to watch the process of how this was decided, and what movements were considered important and how people chose to represent that on a map. I found the process to be really illuminating. And then on the bottom left, you see a vectorized version. So we would georeference it in QGIS and then overlay it on the bottom right-hand side on that drought map that I showed you earlier. And this sort of shows, I think, an interesting power of blending blending Earth observation imagery and indigenous knowledge systems. So we are able to sort of show, okay, this is where the herds are going. And if we see, arrows going towards a red area, we know that the movements are going to change. The herds will either avoid it or they will stay there not for long, because why go to a place where there's not a lot of pasture? So this is how you get the information about where the herders are going. This is how you get information about herders. But more importantly, how do you get information to give to herders, right? There's very little interest in making a map of movements that herding communities make for you and then giving it back to the same people who gave you that information. Rather, their interest on their side is to get what you see on the bottom right. People want to know where's pasture, where's water. They want to get that information quickly. So luckily, we are in a day and age where free and open source satellite imagery has revolutionized a lot of the geospatial industry. The European Space Agency, NASA, operate a fleet of satellites that give this information freely, quickly. And then also we have open source technology, QGIS, the GDAL library, R, Python, PostGIS, all of these tools that are free and open source and that can allow to treat this data without a big budget, or sometimes without any budget at all. The most important thing is having an internet connection and having curiosity to be able to go through it. And you can really start to treat this data. So why isn't it happening? So we have this data and we have institutions that use this data. You have what we call the official early warning systems. Each government in the Sahel has a ministry, usually, that's in charge of looking at this satellite data and making predictions, early warnings, estimates for when the drought is going to happen. Then you have international agencies. So you've got FuseNet, you've got the interstate, the Sahelian, the Interstate Committee on Drought and Desertification. You have the World Bank, which operates the Regional Pastoralism Support Project, the FAO, the World Food Program, all of these that create images like you see in the center of the map, center left, of drought data. And they produce it in maps and reports and bulletins. Whereas the herders have their own early warning system. They have community radio. They have markets where they can speak to other herders that are, passing through, coming and going to other areas. They've got family and friends, across borders, and they have systems of scouts where they can ask someone to go and look and examine an area to see if it has pasture or water. Sometimes these systems work better than the satellite data or the official government data. Sometimes they don't. If it takes several days to send someone out to find information that you can get from satellite readout instantly, it might not work. It's not necessarily better. Whereas on the other side, if you have a satellite image that shows you pasture growing, but you don't know the quality, or you don't know if this is an area that's even accessible to herders, it's not better than the traditional system. So there's a mismatch. And we find that among herders themselves, there are several barriers to being able to use this data. The data that's produced by the official systems are produced in maps, reports, bulletins. Whereas herders oftentimes do not have access to internet on a regular basis. They live in areas where there aren't necessarily cell phone towers all the time. The state has a very limited presence. Literacy is lower than national average for herding communities in a lot of Sahelian countries. So they're not necessarily going to be able to access this data. So we end up in this unfortunate situation where you have two information systems that could complement each other, but don't meet. And you have an official data that is not designed with herders at the center. It's designed for institutions. And so they end up creating data products that might not necessarily best serve pastoralist and herding communities. So this is where this project that I'd like to talk about comes in. So I've been working on this project with a really great team for about 6 years now. And the project's called GARBAL. Obviously, full disclosure, I work for the project, so I'm going to be talking it up more than perhaps the most objective independent observer. But the way this project works, GARBAL is a call center where herders can call in and ask about conditions of pasture, water. They can ask about market prices, and agents at the call center can tell them how things are going in their area of interest. So let's run through the scenario. The herder here seen on the left, he wants to bring his cattle to a village, a specific village, but he doesn't know if there's pasture, water, and he doesn't have people he can call, and he certainly isn't in the position where he can send someone to go look. So he calls the call center and he asks them, hey, how is the pasture in Tessit, which is the village he's going to? So the call center agent goes on the website, they get satellite data, vegetation and water, and they get information collected directly from the field, from other pastoralists on market prices, herd concentration, that's to say whether or not there's a lot of cattle there, and the quality of the pasture. And they get this map. And so the call center agent will zoom in on Tessit and he sees this big red splotch. And so he can tell the herder, it's not so good. So in a nutshell, that's how this project works. The idea is that it can provide a lot of this information to herders in a way that's accessible. It doesn't require the herder to have internet access, just only being able to call. So this is a banner for an advertisement for the center, for the call center. The call center has been active for about for several years now. And there's one in Mali, there's one in Burkina Faso, and then there's another one coming soon in Niger. And the call center is staffed with people who speak a variety of languages. They speak, all of the national languages and all of the languages spoken by pastoralist communities, so they can provide this information to them. And it's run through a consortium. There's Orange, the telecom provider. They manage the call center. SNV is a coordinating, is an NGO that's coordinating a lot of it. But I really think a lot of the added value comes from the presence of pastoralist cooperatives that provide a lot of information. So in Mali, the call center gets information from this organization called TASAC, which is based in northern Mali and has people in a lot of different, about 80 or 90 different sites where they collect information, collect the market prices, they let the agents know whether or not there's been a lot of cattle coming through there. So it's a lot of the information that pastoralists will need. And what I wanted to do for the last few minutes is give you a bit of a demo. And I wanted to actually show you. So you see down here, there's this URL, stamp-map.org/stamp. So if you go to stamp-map.org, you can actually access the interface. It's completely open source. And you can use the data for whatever you want, really. So I go to stampmap.org, and this is the map that pulls up. So it's a little bit messy right now, but it works a lot better when you zoom in. So I'm going to run through what it would happen if someone called. So there's a pastoralist who calls in, and he wants to bring his cattle to Kaji here by the Niger River. So the call center agent gets the call and says, hey, I want to know how the pasture is in Kaji. So he can either go and zoom in on Kaji, or he can type here, Kaji. You can type it into the box, and then it's localized through OpenStreetMap. So we zoom in, and there's a map behind. So there's a map and there's a text box. Now, my internet connection's not awesome right now, so the map is a little bit slow, but I promise you, normally it looks a lot better. On a regular internet connection, it comes out looking pretty good. And the map, when it's not blurry, shows NDVI, it's vegetation, right? So every 10 days, we get a satellite image. Here we go. We get a satellite image every 10 days that shows the conditions of vegetation, going from very weak here, très faible, to très bon, very good. And so we can see here, there's this green. So we can see lots of areas where there's vegetation. And then also water, right? The same satellite gives us a feed for water. So we know that water is available. Mind you, that's kind of cheating. We're looking at a river, there's always water. But this lets us know if the lakes have dried up. But then there's also a text box, which is really cool. So this is for the call center agent. They can get this data provided in text. So it allows them to, give kind of a script and to provide the information to the herder. So it's in French, and it's up to the agent to translate it into the local language. It does not have the capacity yet. The system does not have the capacity to read out the information in a variety of languages. It can only spit it out in French. So, it gives information like, for instance, les pâturages disponibles, the pasture on this site is of good quality. So someone in the field went and looked and saw that the pasture looked pretty good. And it also does an analysis of the GIS data. So, it says the production of biomass this year compared to last year is very good. It's much better than it was last year. And then one of my favorites is that we can actually get price data here. So, let's just say he's calling in and he wants to actually sell his cattle. And, he says, I have I have a young cow. I want to sell her. How much does a young cow fetch? And then here he would look for a jeune femelle, young female, and he sees that it's 145,000 sefer, so just under $300 is what you could sell it for. So the whole point is that this can be a sort of a one-stop shop for herders. And I like this project again because I think that it blends a lot of different types of knowledge. And what I particularly like about it is that this was designed for the herder. It was not designed for an institutional audience, and it was not designed for institutional users. This was designed, through extensive, long participatory consultations with herders. And we ended up with a system that works very well for herders, I think. In Burkina Faso, I don't have the data for Mali on the calls, but I know in Burkina Faso, they get about 50,000 calls a year to the center. So it's working quite well. So in the end, I think this was just a nice sort of thing I wanted to show you of an example. But mapping pastoralism is, it's difficult, and there's a lot of factors at play. And I think that there's still a lot of room for improvement in how it's done institutionally. But my hope is that there will be more projects that put pastoralists at the center of the information. So with that, I'm clocking out a little bit early, which I'm hoping leaves time for questions. I'd like to leave you with this picture of this very fat, very pregnant donkey, the double wide donkey, and my information as well. You can find me on Twitter at Oren_SA. So if you ever want to reach out and talk about cow maps, I'm always interested. So once again, thank you for taking the time to talk and for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'm open. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And that was just wonderful. What a wonderful presentation. Let's open the floor up here for questions. If anybody wants to unmute and ask, go right ahead.
It's Pete here. Can you hear me?
Happy.
Yep. Alex, you said mapping pastoralists. You were mapping the pastoralists with your community, speaking to the people, but you weren't mapping them when you were providing information about the pastures. Have you kind of reversed that telephone lark where you might track where a pastoralist is phoning from and what place they're interested in going to? That might give you an idea of actually mapping the pastoralist, to reverse it, to flip it.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so for a number of reasons, we haven't done that because, for one, it's it's unsure whether or not it's representative of pastoralists, because we're not sure that the vast majority of pastoralists still might not be aware of the call center, so it's not really a representative sample. And likewise, I think we're also hesitant to use data from pastoralists for collecting the information from them without them knowing. So if we were to use this to make maps or to make data sets, I think that there might be it would draw in some ethical questions, I think, that we'd have to consider, especially if we were planning on publicizing any of this data or building a product out of it.
Because that approach is being used for using cell phone and tower data to map other migrations, particularly with malaria, and my colleagues will be able to tell me better than about that. But I mean, they actually have used cell phone data to see where people are going to, where they're coming from, right? Yeah. Particularly in Africa, where cell phones are more prevalent, right? Not more prevalent here, but they've skipped the landlines altogether. Just seems that you would actually be able to start mapping the pastoralists that way, rather than where the good land is and where the pastoralists say they go. You'd actually better see where they do go.
Yeah, and I think it would, I mean, that's one thing that I think would be interesting to map, but I think it would be, we'd have to, I think in order to do that, we'd have to make sure that it was representative, and that, that we could be sure that everyone calling in could consent to their data being used for the studies, for those kinds of studies.
Thank you for an interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have a question, Alex. I was thinking about this while you were talking about, is it possible to use this system as an early warning system for people to stay away from areas because of, let's say, disease or something that's running through a stock of, the livestock, in terms of afflicting their animals and not to expose their animals to other animals in these areas? Because I'm sure that some of these pastoralists perhaps run across one another, the herds. And how do they deal with that? How do they mitigate with that situation? Particularly, like, I don't know if there's outbreaks that really decimate these herds at all, but is this possible that this thing could be used as well as a system to stop outbreaks and nip them in the bud, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that would be, that's something that I would like to see. And you do get those. So, one of the most important parts of the year is the animal vaccination. It happens regularly, it always surprises me, pleasantly surprises me, like when I see just how good a lot of these veterinarians are at getting these vaccines out. So even places that are really far out, you get a lot of herds that get really well vaccinated. And so, the coverage is limited, but it's done with not a lot of resources, and it's done really well in terrible conditions. But that said, that's usually the primary method of avoiding, right? Like, you have to vaccinate your herds. But sometimes you get a case like you had Rift Valley fever in 2016 that just absolutely, destroyed herds, and it was a deadly disease. And in those cases, you're in a situation where you have to really rely on the Ministry of Health. You can't really legally give a lot of this information, because unless it's passed directly, unless it comes straight from the Ministry of Health and it's in an official communique, you can't really send it out. So if you can get that information, and if you can get it publicized, then that's great, and you can give it out. But if you, from the community sort of data collection perspective, like how they get information about prices and stuff, while it could technically work, there are legal barriers as to why they wouldn't be able to do that.
We have Olivier here, and he would like to step into my position here and ask you a question.
Sure.
Hello, Alex. I have a technical question. You have presented a number of maps showing vegetation anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, how do you calculate anomalies in a system where you have very strong year-to-year variations? So what kind of average do you take? Is it compared to last year, or?
That's a really good question. So I'll bring back, so what these maps are, if I zoom back through my gratuitous animations. So here, the ones that typically get shared by Action Contre la Faim, like this one, this is a annual anomaly based on a 20-year average. So you got 20 years of biomass data and you calculate the average. You get better results if you measure on standard deviations. It gives you more interesting results. But we honestly found those results were kind of harder to communicate with institutional audiences.
Okay.
When we were, trying to share it for early warning purposes, it was just easier to show this map and say, hey, we are at 20% of where we should be on the average.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I have another question. You talked about the possibilities of there being conflict. Are there agricultural areas in these spots here where there's a sedentary agriculture and where there could be a possibility of conflict because of herds coming in on droughty years or something and affecting? And where are there, first of all, are there any sedentary types of agricultural systems working across the Sahel at all?
Yes, there are a lot. And so this is kind of the backdrop for a lot of conflict right now is land use. and it's, you know, between sedentary farmers and mobile herders. And there are two narratives, right? The one narrative is that, you know, herds are encroaching on farming communities and, you know, are eating the crops before they're grown and are coming in and invading. And then the other narrative is that, you know, farmers are moving in and cultivating on area that was traditionally reserved for grazing.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, you have both cases. I mean, I think that there's a pretty strong argument to be made that pastoralists have typically been disfavored by state policies, and that like state policies have typically favored sedentary farmers. But you know, the inverse. So I mean, I think that you see a lot of, but I think that there's both cases are happening. So land use conflict is really it's an unfortunate reality, and it's not really getting much better right now. So you do have these conflicting systems of livelihoods.
And it's probably escalating during years where there is drought because there's scarce vegetation. I'm assuming that to be the case, but is that true?
Well, the jury's out actually on it. Like it's definitely like everyone seems to agree, at least from what I've read. And again, I'm not an academic. I haven't done advanced social research on this. All I do is just read what other people have written and, you know, talk to people. But what seems to be the case, at least among the literature, is that everyone agrees that it's an aggravating factor, right? Like climate change and drought is an aggravating factor, but how it interacts is still up for debate. You know, there's a number of thinkers that say there's a direct linear relationship. You have a drought, you have, you know, herds coming in and creating agropastoral conflict. And then some that say it's simply an aggravation of existing land use conflicts, and that you can get still worse land use conflicts within a drought or without a drought. So.
I have a question. This is Esther Mullins in the department here. So is there a mechanism to sort of evaluate how far and wide this call center activity has got, you know, how it's reached the pastoralists, and like how, you know, how essentially their feedback of it, you know, how they kind of how they've used it, or sort of their view on it, since it's so participatory the way that it has been developed? And
yeah, that's an excellent question. So for there are two, so comparing it from Mali and Burkina Faso. So in Burkina Faso, it's a lot easier to see because the IT infrastructure is a little more developed in Burkina Faso. So we can quickly access call logs, for instance. In Mali, we don't have that capacity yet. So in Burkina Faso, we can, you know, get the logs of the conversations that the users had, and we can see, okay, you know, what did this person ask for? And we can figure out how many people are calling for, you know, information on weather, for information on pasture. And so that was where I got the 50,000 calls a year from Burkina Faso. So you can do that at a surface level. And a lot of times the call center agent will ask the user, you know, who's calling in for feedback, and will provide. So sometimes you get that. And that's, I mean, for the most part, that's how it's worked on a day-to-day basis.
mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody out there? Audrey, I don't know if we can hear you. I saw you come up, you were talking. See if you might.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for the talk. I was just curious, my questions pertain to Olivier's and Tim's questions, but you talked about the temporal resolution of the data. I was just curious if you know the spatial resolution of the satellite data, the NDVI that you're using. And my other question was also kind of related to Dr. Fick's question about, so this data, you're giving the data where the good biomass or NDVI or vegetation is, and if they're, you know, crossing boundaries or you're identifying water holes, can this also, you know, lead to conflicts, you know, directing people to this past, you know, this area or that area where maybe there's contentious land use there already, or, you know, this is, maybe they don't have land rights, or, you know, this communal land governed by different groups. And now these other groups, there's like, oh, there's water holes here, or there's good pasture here, good biomass, and, you know, take their herds there. Can that also, you know, is there some sort of indirect, unintentional consequences? Can there, do you think, can that ever be an issue? But, and I also wonder, do you ever work with ILRI in West Africa and coordinate with them? Sorry, that was like 3 questions in one, but.
No problem. Those really, really, really good questions. So I'll start with the last one, ILRI. Not on this project, but so yeah, this project itself doesn't directly coordinate with ILRI, but I mean, there's but I know that, you know, we keep a lot of track of what ILRI is doing. ILRI, I know, is aware of the project, and, like, you know, the pastoralist, the GIS pastoralist community in West Africa is pretty small. So we all, you know, we all cross paths. As for the second question, really good question. Can this promote land use conflicts? And that was something that we wrestled with at the very beginning, was, you know, okay, if we're in a situation where we're giving herders like a map, so, you know, like an audio map, as it were, to finding pasture, is this going to be dangerous? And so that's why we ended up working it in where the call center agent doesn't tell the herder where to go. The call center agent can basically answer a pastoralist. So the pastoralist can query saying, hey, is there pasture in Tessit? And the call center agent can say, yes or no. The call center agent can't say, hey, if you go 10 kilometers to the west in this hamlet, there's good pasture over there, I can see it. That's worked in from the beginning. And that's basically, you can answer the pastoralist question. So so the assumption is that the pastoralist is calling, and they're calling about places, and it's, you know, the broad assumption is the pastoralist is going to call about a place that they have access to, that they have some sort of customary or de facto access to. And then the first question about the satellite data. So there's two vegetation data sets. One is annual biomass, and so that's from Proba-V, and that's a 1 kilometer resolution. So that's, you know, carried out over the course of the rainy season. And then the NDVI, that's Sentinel-2 data, and that's 10 meters, and that's gotten every 10 days. So yeah, but yeah, great questions.
Anybody else out there with some questions?
I think I saw Matt's hand up.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Alex. Really interesting. I was wondering, yeah, the thing with conflict is really interesting as well. But I was wondering, since, you know, it's really difficult to map pastoralist movements, so I'm glad you guys are working on that, but have you noticed any shifts in their movements over the years? Because you read some articles about southward migration in Nigeria and leading to conflict and stuff. So have you guys looked at all at shifts and patterns in that?
So there, yeah, the patterns are shifting. It's not really uniform. So, I mean, you find that if you're in a situation where, so like in a country like Senegal, you know, rainfall is the deciding factor of where the herds will go. And so in a spot where if the rainy season is not good, if we have poor rains and poor pasture growth, the herds will follow their traditional routes, but they'll leave early. Sometimes, so a herd that would normally leave in February might leave in December or November. However, in Mali and in Burkina Faso, conflict is the big driver, right? So it's not necessarily drought that's moving the herds, but it's more often the fact that there's already an ongoing conflict. And so the herds aren't going to go somewhere where they know where their cattle could get rustled by bandits. And that you can't map quite as well. that one is, gathering that data is not advised. It's quite dangerous, and it's hard to systematize it. So that one's a lot harder to see what the trends are. But in terms of movements that are being, governed by natural, but not by natural, but let's just say by land and by vegetation, you do see those changing. And there's also land use, access. There's a lot of places where pastoralists used to graze where they're not allowed to graze anymore, places that are being closed off. And that is, I think, also a pretty big factor of what's changing these movements. There's a lot of these grazing areas are just simply no longer an option. So yeah, I would say those were sort of the factors of how it's changing, of how transhumance is changing.
Anyone else? Last call, so to speak. Okay, well, I think we'll wind it up here. And Alex, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I know you're going to be doing some collaboration with Matthew and Olivia. I could just see it now. I think there's a lot of potential here for research, and I'd like to applaud you on this because it's a wonderful study and a wonderful system you guys are developing. And it's really cool because it's kind of old school. I was working with Sea Grant for the longest time, and we were trying to use flyover data with planes and then satellite data and all this stuff. And the best thing was to give the fishermen and give the boaters maps and let them draw where they go on their routes. And that worked out the best. But this old school technique is fantastic. I think it's really great. And I like Pete's suggestions about using that phone data. I think that was really some really sharp stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was a great idea. Yeah.
Thank you again for a wonderful talk, young man.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, we'll see you all next week. Esther's going to be talking, Esther Mullins, and she's going to be doing a talk on extreme precipitation. We look forward to that. And again, thank you so much for attending, everybody.